Sidney Cam sketched on the back of an envelope at Hawker's Kingston design office in 1957, working a problem no aerodynamicist in Burbank or Long Island had cracked: how to lift a combat aircraft straight off the ground without the engine eating itself. He was 64, the man who had drawn the Hurricane in 1934, and the envelope showed 4 nozzles arranged around a central turbojet. The drawing went to Stanley Hooker at Bristol Engine Company, who recognized what Cam had stumbled toward: a single engine that vectored its thrust through swiveling exhaust nozzles, rather than the brute force lift-jet contraptions every other team was building. Dassault had the Balzac. Short Brothers had the SC-1 with 5 separate engines bolted together. The Americans at Bell had tried the X-14 with deflector vanes. All of them flew, in the sense that they left the ground. None of them were aircraft you could send into combat with bombs and fuel. The breakthrough sat inside a French patent. Michel Wibault, an aeronautical engineer in Paris, had filed a design in 1956 for a gyroptere using a Bristol Orion turboshaft driving 4 centrifugal blowers. It was unworkable as drawn, too heavy, too complex, but Hooker's team at Bristol grasped what Wibault hadn't: drive the nozzles directly from a fan and a jet pipe, not through gearboxes. By January 1957, Hooker had a proposal called the BE.53, eventually named Pegasus. Funding came not from the Treasury, which had no interest, but from the Mutual Weapons Development Program in Paris, an American-led NATO fund administered by Colonel Bill Chapman of the U.S. Air Force. Washington paid 75% of the development costs of the engine that would embarrass American engineering for the next 30 years. The first hover happened on October 21, 1960, at Dunsfold Aerodrome in Surrey. The aircraft was a tethered prototype designated P.1127, registration XP831, painted in primer with no service markings. Chief test pilot Bill Bedford had a broken ankle from a car crash in Germany and flew the hover on crutches. The machine rose 3 feet, hung there shuddering on 4 columns of hot gas, and settled back. Transition to wing-borne flight. The genuine engineering nightmare, the moment when the nozzles rotated aft and the aircraft had to find lift from its wings before the jet-borne thrust ran out, came on September 12, 1961. Nobody at the Ministry of Aviation in Whitehall was certain it would work. The aerodynamic models predicted a region of flight, roughly between 30 and 90 knots, in which the aircraft might simply fall out of the sky. It didn't fall. The P.1127 transitioned cleanly, and over the following 4 years, 6 prototypes flew at Dunsfold, 2 of them crashing. The accidents were instructive. XP836 lost a nozzle over Yeovilton in December 1961. XP972 went into the trees at Tangmere in 1965. Each failure was analysed by Hawker engineers and the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, and each time the airframe came back stronger. By 1965, the Ministry of Aviation had ordered 9 pre-production Kestrels for a tripartite evaluation squadron: Britain, the United States, West Germany, based at RAF West Raynham in Norfolk. The squadron flew for 11 months. The American pilots wrote glowing reports and went home. What happened next inside the Pentagon would astonish the men at Kingston. 2 American Kestrels, redesignated XV-6A, were shipped to Edwards Air Force Base. The engineers who took them apart could not replicate what they were looking at. The first sign that something was wrong inside the American defense establishment came in a memorandum from John Foster, Director of Defense Research and Engineering, dated March 14, 1966. Foster instructed the Navy and Air Force to evaluate the Kestrel for operational use. The Navy passed. The Air Force passed. The Marine Corps, specifically a colonel named Tom Miller and a lieutenant colonel called Bud Baker, both fighter pilots, both attached to the Naval Air Test Center at Patuxent River, refused to let the file close. Miller flew XV-6A, serial 64-18266, in March 1968 at Patuxent, and filed a report that read like a conversion experience. The aircraft, he wrote, could operate from any clearing large enough for a tennis court. The Marines had been looking for exactly this since Guadalcanal. Close air support that didn't depend on a runway the Seabees hadn't built yet. What followed was a procurement decision that no senior officer in the United States Marine Corps could afterwards remember being made. There was no competition. There was no American prototype. In December 1969, the Marines announced they would buy the British aircraft outright, manufactured by Hawker Siddeley at Kingston and Dunsfold, with the engine built by Rolls-Royce at Bristol, a foreign combat aircraft entering frontline American service for the first time since the Spitfire flown by the Eagle squadrons in 1942. The order was for 102 airframes designated AV-8A, with deliveries beginning in 1971. The reason given to Congress was operational urgency. The reason discussed in private at the Pentagon was different. McDonnell Douglas in St. Louis had been asked in the mid-1960s whether they could build a competing design. Their answer, transmitted through Vice President Sanford McDonnell's office, was that they could not in any reasonable time frame, not at any reasonable cost. North American aviation had tried with the XF-V12, a thrust-augmented wing concept funded from 1972 onwards. The aircraft never hovered. It was tethered to a gantry at the Lakehurst Naval Air Station in 1977 and produced only 75% of the thrust its designers had calculated. The program was cancelled in 1981 after $135 million of expenditure. Inside the Bristol Engine Company offices at Patchway near Filton, the Pegasus team understood why the Americans were struggling. Stanley Hooker had retired, but his successor, John Dale, spoke at the Royal Aeronautical Society in 1972 about what he called the balance problem. A vectored thrust aircraft had to balance on 4 columns of thrust during hover, and the geometry meant that the fan and the high-pressure turbine had to rotate in opposite directions to cancel gyroscopic precession. If they rotated the same way, a pilot pulling rudder in the hover would induce a roll the aircraft could not recover from. Bristol had built contra-rotating spools into the Pegasus from the first prototype in 1959. Pratt & Whitney, asked to study a competing engine for North American's XF-V12, had not. The XF-V12's J402 derivative would have torn itself apart in any genuine VSTOL flight regime. There was a second problem the Americans had not solved: hot gas reingestion. When a Harrier hovered close to the ground, its own exhaust gases, at 670 degrees Celsius, rose around the airframe and threatened to be sucked back into the intake, causing immediate thrust loss and a crash. The Kingston team had spent 4 years from 1962 to 1966 redesigning the intake geometry, fitting auxiliary doors and developing what they called puffer jets at the wingtips for hover stability. Every modification had been earned through accidents at Dunsfold. The data sat in filing cabinets in Surrey. The Marines wanted those filing cabinets. A delegation from McDonnell Douglas flew to Kingston upon Thames in April 1969 under the terms of a licensing agreement brokered by Hawker Siddeley's managing director, Sir Arnold Hall. The agreement gave the American firm rights to manufacture the AV-8A in the United States and, crucially, to develop an improved variant of their own. The British negotiating team, led by Hall and supported by John Stack at Hawker Siddeley Aviation, set the licensing fee at 5% of the unit price, a figure that struck the Treasury as derisory, but which Hall defended on the grounds that without American manufacturing scale, the Pegasus production line at Patchway would collapse within 5 years. The Royal Air Force had ordered only 60 Harriers for No. 1 Squadron at Wittering and No. 4 Squadron in Germany. That order alone could not sustain the engine program. What Hall did not anticipate was the speed at which the Americans would attempt to take the design away from him. McDonnell Douglas engineers arriving in Surrey requested and received complete sets of drawings, stress calculations and flight test records from the P.1127, Kestrel and Harrier programs. They sat in the Kingston works for 3 months photographing the production jigs and interviewing the 4 men on the shop floor. When they returned to St. Louis, they began work on what they called the AV-16, a stretched Harrier with double the payload and twice the range. The British contribution was to be reduced to engine supply and a junior partnership in the airframe. In Whitehall, the Ministry of Defence procurement executive realised in 1973 that the Americans were proposing to develop a successor aircraft using British technology, with the British relegated to subcontractor status. Sir Michael Carey, the permanent Undersecretary, raised the matter with Lord Carrington, then Secretary of State for Defence. Carrington's view, recorded in a Cabinet Office memorandum dated November 9, 1973, was that Britain could not afford to fund the AV-16 development. Treasury estimates put the British share at £180 million over 7 years. The economy that year was contracting, the miners were preparing the strike that would bring down the Heath government in February, and the 3-day week was about to be imposed. The AV-16 was cancelled by both governments in March 1975. The Americans went ahead alone. McDonnell Douglas redesigned the wing, a supercritical aerofoil developed by NASA Langley, and the result was the AV-8B Harrier II, first flown in November 1981. The aircraft was 60% American by component count. The engine remained the Pegasus, now manufactured under license by Pratt & Whitney as the F402. Britain bought the resulting aircraft back from McDonnell Douglas, designated as the Harrier GR.5, with British Aerospace at Kingston acting as junior partner. The flag of ownership had inverted. A British design built around a British engine with 3 decades of British operational data now flew under American patent. Sir Frank Cooper, Permanent Secretary at the MOD from 1976 to 1982, told the historian Peter Hennessy in a 1988 interview that the Harrier saga was the clearest case he could remember of British technical brilliance being undone by British industrial weakness. The aircraft was, he said, the only one in NATO of which the Americans had genuinely been afraid. The fear lasted as long as it took the Americans to write the cheque. At Dunsfold, the test pilots kept flying. The Falklands campaign of 1982 settled the question of whether the original aircraft could fight. 20 Sea Harriers from 800 and 801 naval air squadrons embarked aboard HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible in early April. 6 more drawn from 809 NAS, a squadron reformed at RNAS Yeovilton specifically for the operation, joined the task force at Ascension on May 18th. They carried American AIM-9L Sidewinder missiles, supplied at speed by the Reagan administration after representations from the British Defence Staff in Washington under Admiral Sir James Eberly. The Sidewinder was all aspect. It could engage an Argentine fighter from any angle, not merely the rear quarter. Without it, the air war over San Carlos water might have gone differently. The Sea Harrier FRS.1 had been ordered for the Royal Navy in 1975, over Treasury objections that the aircraft was inferior to anything operated by the United States Navy. Its radar, the Ferranti Blue Fox, was a downgraded version of the Lightning set. Its top speed in level flight was Mach 0.97. Argentine Skyhawks could outrun it. The case for the Sea Harrier had been made by Admiral Sir Michael Pollock, First Sea Lord from 1971 to 1974, on a single argument. Without a fixed-wing aircraft, the Royal Navy could not contest air superiority over its own fleet, and without air superiority, the surface fleet could not operate beyond land-based air cover. The carriers Hermes and Invincible were too small for conventional jets. The Harrier, with its ski jump ramp developed by Lieutenant Commander Doug Taylor at the Admiralty Research Establishment in 1973, was the only solution physics allowed. In the South Atlantic, the aircraft shot down 23 Argentine fighters and bombers for no air-to-air losses of its own. The kill ratio astonished American naval aviators. Commander Sharkey Ward of 801 Squadron, flying from Invincible, accounted for 3 of the kills personally. Lieutenant Commander Andy Auld of 800 Squadron shot down 2 A-4 Skyhawks over Choiseul Sound on May 21st. The Argentine pilots, well trained at the Escuela de Aviación Militar in Córdoba, found themselves outmaneuvered by an aircraft their intelligence assessments had described as a bomb truck. The vectoring in forward flight technique, VIFF-ing, had been developed at Dunsfold by John Farley in the late 1960s. Pulling the nozzle lever back in combat dumped airspeed instantly and pointed the aircraft's nose at a chasing fighter. The Argentines had no answer. What the campaign did not settle was the political question that had haunted the Harrier since the AV-16 cancellation in 1975. The Royal Air Force had been forced by the Healy defence cuts of 1966 to abandon the CVA-01 fleet carrier programme and to surrender its strike role east of Suez. The Harrier survived only because it could operate without aircraft carriers, from forward strips and motorway laybys in Germany. By 1982, the entire British fixed-wing combat strength outside Germany consisted of Phantom interceptors, Buccaneer strike aircraft, and Harriers. The Buccaneer was being retired. The Phantom would follow. The Harrier alone would carry the Royal Air Force's tactical air component through to the end of the Cold War. Margaret Thatcher, briefed at Chequers on the evening of June 14th, 1982, by the Chief of the Defence Staff Admiral Sir Terence Lewin, asked whether more Harriers could be built. The answer from Sir Frank Cooper was that the production line at Kingston was already running at capacity, and the Americans now controlled the Pegasus tooling. The factory at Kingston would not survive the decade. Production at Kingston upon Thames had begun in 1942 with the Hawker Tempest, and continued without interruption for 46 years. The works employed 3,500 people at their peak in the late 1960s, scattered across a complex of buildings beside Canbury Park Road that backed onto the river. By 1985, the workforce had fallen to under 2,000. British Aerospace, formed by the nationalisation of Hawker Siddeley and the British Aircraft Corporation in 1977, and privatised by Thatcher in 1981, was assessing the long-term viability of every site in its inheritance. The Kingston Works occupied prime real estate in a southwest London suburb. The land was, by 1986, worth more than the factory. The decision to close came from Sir Raymond Ligo, Chief Executive of British Aerospace, in a board meeting on February 17, 1988. Production of the Harrier GR5 would transfer to Dunsfold, where final assembly already took place. Design work would move to Brew in East Yorkshire. The Kingston site would be sold to developers. Ligo, a former Sea Vixen pilot and Royal Navy admiral, was not sentimental about facilities. He was building a company that could compete with Boeing and Dassault, and he believed the British aerospace industry could no longer afford to maintain 6 separate airframe factories across the country. The unions disagreed. The Amalgamated Engineering Union called a one-day strike on March 8, 1988. It changed nothing. What disappeared with Kingston was not merely a workforce, but a body of tacit knowledge, the specific manual skills required to build a vectored thrust aircraft. The Pegasus engine nozzles had to be balanced to within fractions of a kilogram, so that the aircraft did not roll on takeoff. The composite wing of the GR5, supplied by McDonnell Douglas, met a fuselage built in Surrey, using techniques the Americans had been unable to replicate. The shop floor engineers at Kingston had spent 30 years learning how to make those components fit. When the factory closed in 1988, men in their late 50s were offered redundancy or relocation to Yorkshire. Most took the money. The skills went with them into retirement. Inside the Ministry of Defence, the closure was viewed as inevitable. Michael Heseltine, Defence Secretary until his resignation over Westland in January 1986, had presided over the Nimrod AEW.3 disaster, a British-designed airborne early warning aircraft cancelled in December 1986 after £900 million of expenditure, and replaced by the American Boeing E-3 Sentry. The Nimrod failure had damaged the political case for protecting British military aerospace at any cost. George Younger, Heseltine's successor, accepted the BAE rationalisation without serious objection. The Treasury under Nigel Lawson was supportive. The cost of maintaining Kingston was set against the cost of subsidising other sectors of British industry, and the calculation came out against the aircraft works. What survived was Dunsfold. The aerodrome where the P.1127 had first hovered in 1960 remained in operation as a flight test centre throughout the late Cold War, producing Harrier GR-5S and GR-7S for the RAF and Sea Harriers for the Royal Navy. The runway at Dunsfold, surrounded by Surrey woodland, continued to receive new airframes from Brough by road for final assembly and first flight. Bill Bedford, who had hovered the original prototype on crutches in 1960, returned to Dunsfold in 1988 to mark the closure of Kingston and watch a GR-5 demonstration from the same patch of taxiway he had flown from 28 years earlier. The cost accountants in London had not finished. GCHQ Cheltenham had been monitoring Soviet technical intelligence collection against British military aerospace since the early 1960s. The Soviet effort against the Harrier program intensified after the 1969 Paris Air Show, where the aircraft made its public flying debut, and Yakovlev Design Bureau personnel in attendance filed extensive observation reports back to Moscow. The Yakovlev Yak-36, an experimental Soviet VSTOL aircraft that had been flying since 1963, used twin-lift cruise engines in a configuration similar to the failed Dassault Balzac. The Yak-38, which entered Soviet naval service from 1976 aboard the Kiev-class carriers, retained the same flawed architecture: separate lift engines that contributed dead weight in cruise flight and consumed fuel without producing useful thrust. What the JIC assessed in a paper circulated to the Cabinet Office in 1978 was that the Soviet Union had failed to replicate the vectored thrust concept despite intensive effort. The reason, according to the assessment drafted by analysts at the Defence Intelligence Staff under Air Vice Marshal Sir John Aiken, was metallurgical. The Pegasus engine's hot nozzles operated at temperatures that required nickel-based superalloys developed by Rolls-Royce in the 1950s for the Avon and Conway engines. Soviet metallurgy in the late 1960s could not match those alloys, particularly for components that had to rotate under thermal stress. The Yak-141, a third-generation Soviet design that did eventually achieve vectored thrust in the late 1980s, flew only 4 prototypes and was cancelled in 1991 after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. MI6 had a parallel concern. The Harrier represented a specific export control problem because the licensing agreement with McDonnell Douglas had given the Americans rights to sell the AV-8B to third parties. Spain bought the aircraft for the Príncipe de Asturias in 1987. Italy followed for the Giuseppe Garibaldi in 1989. The decisions about who could buy a vectored thrust aircraft were now being taken in Washington, not London. When the Indian Navy approached British Aerospace in 1983 to acquire Sea Harriers for INS Vikrant, the negotiations had to be cleared not only through the Ministry of Defence but through the Pentagon, because the Pegasus engine contained technology Pratt & Whitney, now part-owned. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office under Sir Geoffrey Howe handled the diplomatic side. The technical clearances took 11 months. The Cold War significance of all this was not the aircraft itself, but what it revealed about the structure of Western military aerospace. The Harrier had been born from British engineering ingenuity and American development funding through the Mutual Weapons Development Program in 1959. It had been kept alive in the 1960s by Royal Air Force and Royal Navy requirements. It had been industrialized in the 1970s through licensing to McDonnell Douglas. By the 1980s, it was a joint Anglo-American product, with the Americans holding the senior position in every commercial transaction. The pattern would repeat with the joint development of the Trident D5 submarine missile system, agreed by Thatcher and Reagan at Camp David in 1982, in which Britain bought a complete American weapons system because the cost of indigenous development exceeded the national defense budget for any politically tolerable time frame. Sir Percy Craddock, chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee from 1985 to 1992, observed in a 1989 paper that British technical leadership in any single military domain could no longer be sustained against the resources of the United States, but that specific British capabilities, the Cheveline warhead modification for Polaris, the Type 23 frigate's quiet propulsion, the Harrier's vectored thrust, created leverage in the alliance disproportionate to the size of the British economy. The aircraft was now a card to be played. The card was played in 1990. When Iraq invaded Kuwait on August 2nd, the Bush administration assembled a coalition that required British participation not merely for political legitimacy, but for specific military capabilities the Americans lacked or possessed in insufficient quantity. The Royal Air Force deployed Tornado GR, one-strike aircraft to Bahrain, and Tabuk. The Royal Navy committed frigates and destroyers to the Gulf. The British Army sent 1st Armoured Division with Challenger 1 main battle tanks. The Harrier force was held in reserve. 12 GR-7s from No. 1 Squadron at Wittering were prepared for deployment, but not used in the air campaign that began on January 17, 1991. Their absence was telling. The reason given was operational. The Harrier's value in the Gulf, with prepared airfields available across Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, was marginal. Tornadoes could carry heavier weapons loads over longer distances. Jaguars could deliver laser-guided bombs with greater accuracy. The Harrier's specific advantage, dispersed operations from unprepared sites, meant nothing in a campaign where the coalition controlled every runway from Dhahran to Doha. The aircraft had been designed for a war that the Cold War never produced, a Soviet armoured breakthrough into West Germany, with NATO airfields cratered by frontal aviation strikes and Harriers operating from clearings beside the Autobahn near Hanover and Wildenrath. That war did not come. The Berlin Wall fell on November 9, 1989. The Warsaw Pact dissolved in July 1991. The Soviet Union itself ceased to exist on December 25, 1991. The Harrier, conceived in 1957 to fight an enemy that vanished 34 years later, found itself an aircraft in search of a mission. The Royal Air Force restructured RAF Germany, which had operated Harriers from Gütersloh and Labruck since 1969, was wound down through 1992 and 1993. The forward operating sites in the West German countryside, the laybys, the woodland strips, the disguised hangars, were closed and returned to civilian use. Soldiers and airmen who had spent careers preparing for a Soviet invasion went home. What remained was an aircraft with proven combat experience in the Falklands and a manufacturer, British Aerospace, that had absorbed its Cold War lessons. The GR-7, introduced in 1989, was the most capable variant ever built. It carried thermal imaging and laser designation pods, could operate at night, and integrated Maverick missiles for anti-armor work. The Sea Harrier FA-2 with the Blue Vixen radar and AMRAAM missiles entered service in 1993. Both aircraft would see action over Bosnia, Kosovo and Iraq in the decade after the Cold War ended. None of those operations validated the original concept. The Harrier had been built to fight from beat fields in Lower Saxony. It ended its career flying from carriers in the Adriatic and Arabian seas, doing work that conventional aircraft could have done as well or better. The Americans understood this earlier than the British. The AV-8B Harrier II was retired from US Marine Corps service in 2025, replaced by the F-35B Lightning II, an aircraft whose lift fan technology was British in origin, designed by Rolls-Royce engineers in Derby and Indianapolis. The lineage from the Pegasus to the F-35 ran through every test flight at Dunsfold, every accident at Tangmere, every drawing on every envelope at Kingston. American engineers, having failed for 30 years to build a vectored thrust combat aircraft, eventually built one with British help. The man who had drawn the first sketch did not live to see it. Sidney Cam died on March 12, 1966, at the Burr Hill Golf Club in Walton-on-Thames, where he had played a round in the afternoon. He was 72. The cause was a heart attack. His obituary in the Times described him as the designer of the Hurricane, the P.1127, which had transitioned to wing-borne flight 5 years earlier, and which the Marines were that month evaluating at Patuxent River, received a single sentence. The Harrier, the aircraft that would carry his concept into frontline service, would not enter Royal Air Force squadrons until April 1st, 1969, 3 years after his death and on the day he would have turned 75. The men around him outlived the Cold War. Stanley Hooker, the engineer who had taken Wibault's flawed patent and built the Pegasus around it, died in 1984. Bill Bedford, the test pilot on crutches at Dunsfold in 1960, died in 1996. John Farley, who had developed the VIFF-ing technique that gave Sea Harrier pilots their margin over Argentine Skyhawks in 1982, lived until 2018. Sir Arnold Hall, who had signed the licensing agreement with McDonnell Douglas in 1969 and surrendered the senior position in the program for 5% of the unit price, died in 2000. Each of them had given evidence at one point or another to historians, to RAES symposia, to the staff of the Imperial War Museum at Duxford and Lambeth. The records sit in archives in London, Yeovilton and Hendon. They are extensive. What the records reveal, when read against the American documentation now declassified at the National Archives in College Park, is that the Harrier was the last major piece of military technology in which Britain set the global standard. The Chieftain tank, designed at the Military Vehicles and Engineering Establishment at Chertsey in the 1960s, had no foreign emulators and few foreign sales. The Type 42 destroyer was a competent ship that sank twice in the Falklands. The Polaris program had been bought wholesale from the Americans in 1962. The Trident D5 system would be bought wholesale from the Americans in 1982. The Eurofighter Typhoon, which began design studies in the same year Kingston closed, was a four-nation project in which British leadership was contested by Germany and Italy from the outset. The Harrier had been British in a way that nothing that followed could be. The closure of the Kingston Works in 1988 took place during the final years of the Cold War, when the certainties that had built the aircraft were dissolving. Margaret Thatcher's government had restructured British industry around what it considered competitive principles, that manufacturing should compete in international markets without state subsidy, that the Treasury should not preserve facilities for strategic reasons, that the proper role of the state was to write defence contracts and let industry organise itself accordingly. The result was a British aerospace sector that survived as a junior partner in American-led programs. By the time the F-35 entered Royal Air Force service in 2018, the Pegasus engine's direct descendant was being manufactured by Rolls-Royce as a component of a Lockheed Martin aircraft. The flag had moved across the Atlantic. At Dunsfold today, the runway remains, used as a test track for a motoring television program. The aerodrome buildings still stand. A plaque marks the spot where XP-831 first hovered on October 21st, 1960. 3 feet above the ground for less than a minute, on a still Surrey afternoon. The engineers who watched are dead. The aircraft is in a museum. The drawings are in a filing cabinet in a development office in St. Louis,